And it's time to get our first speaker on the stage today. So Diane Majors is a very long time friend of mine. She's currently the founder and CEO of Experience Catalysts and an emeritus chair and past CEO of the CXPA. And I think we got to know each other when you were working for AT&T in customer experience strategy. I think that was more or less the time for that.
Way back when.
Way back then. And you told me, I didn't know this was news to me, but you have also an MS in clinical psychology. So that's an interesting background to be talking about CX and ROI, but we will be hearing more about that shortly. Something people don't generally know about Diane also is that the first time she got to see the ocean when she was snorkeling on the Great Barrier Reef when she was an exchange student to Australia in high school. So that must have been some nice views over there, I guess. But I'm going to let you talk more about
yes.
maybe ROI now.
Yes. One of the things that she mentioned was that I do have a master's in clinical psychology, but I'm a little bit of an odd duck because I also have an MBA. So during my work in customer experience, I worked for a logistics company, and one of the things that I had to prove was absolutely the ROI, because a supply chain, very analytical driven company really needed to understand the financial impact. So that's where I built these skills. So if I can do it, anybody can do it. So I'm going to share with you some of the approaches that I've had and some very tactical ways to think about experience. One of the things we talk about is really connecting the dots for people. And I'm going to talk about those dots specifically and how you bring them together. But what I want you to walk away with is that we need to convert what we call, Greg Tucker and I call, CX speak to C-suite speak. We need to develop the language that our executives are using and understand that in a deeper way so that we can begin to really pull this value out of what we're doing. So hang on tight because I'm going to go fast. Everybody will tell you I talk really fast. What I want to start with is just a model or a framework for you to really think about when you think about value and ROI or ROX that you're creating. It's a process. It's not just reporting out the numbers for Net Promoter Score or CSAT or your dashboard. This is about the financial impact you're having to the organization, both through the discipline of what you're doing, which is usually intangible but very tangible, and from projects that you're working on. So I want you to think about, as I talk through this today, think about this as a framework. And Greg Tucker and I have a class where we teach a lot of this in detail, and we follow this process. We're going to talk about your strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? Do you have a plan for value? We're going to talk about how you embed what you're doing in your journey discovery and use value there. We'll talk about how you design it into, in the business case, into what you're doing. We'll talk about then the creation of that experience and the value behind it. We'll talk about benefits and value realization. So that's telling the story about the impact that you've had, and then how you continue to optimize the value by reaching across the organization and several other ways that you can do that. So think about this as a process as I go through these examples. So the best way for you to really think about and connect anybody to value around experiences, ask them to think about a good or bad experience they've had with an organization or a brand. Okay, so we do this all the time. But what I want you to listen for, and I want you to help them translate when they tell you their story, their horror story of going into a restaurant or a travel experience, whatever it is, or a really good one, is help them connect the fact that what the brand did, how they serviced, how they priced, how they marketed, all drove how we felt and how we were able to achieve our goals. You know, were we able to get that awesome meal we were after? Were we able to get in and out of the restaurant quickly? How did it make us feel? You know, was it a delightful experience? Was it like ho-hum kind of, yeah, it was just food? But what drives that is, if we think about from a behavior standpoint, our emotions drive our behavior. So when we have a bad experience, particularly, we avoid going back. We don't stay, we spend less with that brand, we tell other people not to go there, or vice versa. We tell people that, hey, we refer them to others. That's what drives the impact of the brand. It's really about changing the customer behavior. based on the emotions that they're having. That drives the brand impacts. And you can see here, I don't talk anything about Net Promoter Score. I'm talking about revenue, share of wallet, reduced cost, referrals. This is part of what your C-suite is talking about. So connecting the experience to the behavior to the business outcomes is the first step in your strategy. Also talking about this longer term balance between customer value and creating value for them, and also creating value for the organization. So any of you who've ever had an experience with a brand can say, you know, did it help me achieve my goals? Did it save me time? Did I get quality for what I paid for? All of those things create value for us. So this is value creation. You're going to hear a lot about this new topic, or if you haven't already, about how we're creating value in the world and with our customers. But it's balanced with the business value. So executives have to understand that we have to do things to create the value for customers, which will show up as value for us. Now, back to my first example. The second thing I want you to think about is in your strategy, you have to really define what it is you're doing. So one of the things that I always people get really confused about is when you talk about measures or metrics or business value. And I'm going to be very clear, this is my approach to it, and only because I think you'll see the connection here. I talk about measures, experience measures, as things you can count. So clicks to resolve, time to renew a contract, social media mentions, product complaints. It's anything you can count. A metric is an outcome, and it typically reflects a perception. So Net Promoter Score, effort score, word of mouth. It's not connected really to any particular event. It's more about all the things that happen in an overall perception. So that's a metric. Then we talk about value, and this is the actual financial impact. One of the things that I'll demonstrate to you, and I show you this next example, is if you're trying to correlate Net Promoter with revenue, that's great, but it's not a direct connection. But if you're connecting time to renew contract and reducing that to cost and revenue, accelerating revenue, there is a direct causation between those two. So causation and correlation are two things I want you to be thinking about. You can correlate Net Promoter Score, effort score with your revenue growth, but you can also talk about causation of if we make this change, we're going to drive revenue, productivity, share of wallet. So I want you to think about those two things separately because they're two sides of the value story. Here's an example of this, and I want you to kind of listen to the story about a car automaker who focused on, they had a Net Promoter Score, obviously, that was very low at 29, on the negative 29. And then a couple years later, as they went through all of these different changes, they were at a 70. Well, what happened is when they got to 70, the executive said, you know what, we're at a pretty good Net Promoter Score. I think we're kind of done with experience. We've gotten to the point where we're benchmarking. What they didn't realize, what this practitioner had not done, is talked about the financial impact and understood the financial impact even when they had these changes and had a high Net Promoter Score. Turns out they were leaking revenue all along these changes. So they were making changes, but they weren't paying attention to the entire financial number. And the practitioner did not talk about the changes other than the Net Promoter impact, where she could have talked about word of mouth referrals and reducing cost to acquire, reducing operational costs and defection, and quantify that in dollars. So she was only telling one side of the story, this correlation and not the causation she was having. So we need to change our story. We need to talk about the fact that we can increase revenue, reduce costs, whatever those numbers are, the financial impact, and as the other side of the story, increase Net Promoter Score, effort, and satisfaction, right? So we need to be talking about both sides of the story. The reason that we need to think about this in our strategy also is as we go into really thinking about what are the executives and the perspectives of the organization, what are people looking for? So think about your CFO versus your HR person versus your CIO versus your operations person. They're all looking for something different. They all understand that there is impact for customer experience, but they think about it in different ways. And you can see some of the examples here. So we need to think about how when we talk about this CX speak, I call it the Net Promoter Score, dropping because of these things, or our Net Promoter key drivers are these, when really we want the executives to be talking about, because we were able to reduce the cost of leads by 13%, because we increased our word of mouth referrals through this customer experience change that we made, that's what had the impact. and putting dollars against that and showing and demonstrating how customer experience equals revenue and value. So that's kind of the translation that we still are trying to get to. But not just your C-suite. Every team has different business goals. So I want you to think about when you do a cross-functional project in an organization, you have people from marketing and sales and finance. I hope you do anyway. Operations and care. All of them have their own goals they're trying to achieve. And one of the things that I would tell you, I learned early, you can create a project that has some impact for them. They are huge proponents. They are engaged and involved, and that's part of what we need to make sure we capitalize on. So let's talk a little bit about experience design then. So great, you've told me that I need to change the story. So how do I put that into what I'm doing? So when I'm designing an experience, I need to think about things a little bit differently. I need to look at the whole experience, the whole ecosystem, because there is value created in many different ways by making a change to the experience. So let's say you're changing an app, for example. You may look at workflow processes and say, hey, we're going to be able to redirect and shorten this time frame to get to our payments, right? Reduce sales outstanding. That's revenue. We may be able to make people more productive. That's cost. We may be able to put more things in the app that engage people for content that if we engage them more, we drive more share of wallet, cost, revenue. So looking more holistically for where you can pull information, you can pull opportunity and value components. An example of this would be one company I worked with, they had 5 knowledge management systems. I don't know why, but we were able to reduce those to 1, which reduced their cost to maintain and their IT cost of ownership, and clean their data up, as well as their content, which also meant that people could get to the information quicker, which made them more productive. So you need to look for these extended ways that your projects are bringing in value, not just one. So what I always do in experience mapping and journey mapping, whatever you call it, I make sure that I have, what's the financial impact of the experience to the brand as a result of the current experience. So it's usually always negative, productivity, cost. When you redesign the new experience, you can always reverse that value and say, now that we've changed that experience, we are going to change the financial impact and make it positive or reduce cost. And make these things tangible and intangible. You're always going to have tangible along some way, but don't forget to include the intangibles. And in this case, this is a nonprofit. They actually talked about value to the donor. So what's the value to the donor of being a part of this experience? In that wheel that we talked about earlier, I think you also need to think about, it's great for you to do a project, but what I see all the time happen with professionals is they don't go back and tell the story. They do not manage the outcome of that project. And guess what? Everybody else, from your salesperson to your operations person, is getting investment in their projects. They're coming back to the executive and talking about what benefits they got out of it over time, right? So 6 months in, a week in, a month in, 6 months, annualized, they're sharing the benefit that came out of the change that they made. So when you think about what you're doing, you have to have a process to say, we need to be able to put this into a financial model. We need to be able to track the benefits and build that business case out. We need to track those benefits, like getting baselines, looking at the change in behavior, looking at the change in impact. We're going to find benefits that are what I call emergent. They're things that you did not anticipate were going to happen. Being more effective or efficient. And then really getting insight into some of the intangibles, like going back and revisiting as a result of changing the experience, both internally and externally, where might we have gotten intangible benefits that we can help quantify? This is the goodwill line on the balance sheet, by the way. If you ever talk to your CFO, which I highly recommend you do, goodwill is on the balance sheet. And those are your intangible things, but also things like collaboration in your organization. Highly tangible because you're reducing the time and effort it takes to get a project done. And that's productivity, that's acceleration of benefits. And then sharing the stories. One of the things I also see people not do is go back to your stakeholders and talk about the fact that because you were a part of this project and because of what we did in changing the experience, here's the benefits that you got as a result of that. Now, you're not going to be able to solve everybody's problems and talk to every single person, but the more you look holistically and think about the benefits you're bringing to the organization, the more you can go back to your shareholders and talk about some of this. So let's go back to the stories again, right? Everything that we do impacts human lives, impacts how people feel, changes their behavior, which is where our financial impact comes from. So when people talk to me about customer experience versus marketing, I say, well, I'm changing customer behavior just like marketing. Marketing's trying to get people to engage and do X, Y, and Z. I'm doing the same thing by changing the experience. We talk about then the actions, the impacts, and the outcomes that we're going to get as a result of it. So return on investment. I need money to go do something so I can change the experience, so I can drive financial value. Return on the experience change. So we have impact, which is the cost. I need money to go do this. The benefit we're going to get out of it, and that's where your financial impact or ROI is. This is how executives talk. This lower line is where executives are thinking every day about where do we invest that's going to have the most optimal impact. And the thing you need to tell them is, because you're thinking more holistically and doing projects across the journey, the investment and the impact of that can be larger than a small scale one pull of somebody working in their silo. So it's another way for you to talk about what you're doing. And then the best thing you can do is begin to really asking, that question at the beginning of talk about a bad experience you've had. If you also, sorry, my internet's unstable. If you also start to ask the right questions, especially around your growth goals, and say, what if our experience changes could retain 1% more of our base or increase customer lifetime value by 1%? And what I love to do is go to my CFO and say, well, what is 1% of our customer lifetime value? What is that dollar figure? Or cost of marketing? What if we reduce that? What's the dollar value of that? So that people begin to connect the change of experience to the financial impact. And then keep the stories human. So I talk a lot about business value, but we also have to bring the human story alongside of it, so people understand the changes that we're making. Numbers give us credibility, but the stories really move people to action. So I'm not saying go just give your financial story, but really bring that financial story in with the human story on the other side. So delivering experiences is driving value. The potential that you have, that it really isn't being realized. If you think about all the things I've just talked about, how many of those are you doing, and how are you driving your organization? Are you engaging the leaders? Are you talking their talk? Are you talking in CX speak to C-suite speak? And then what are the approaches that you're using? Do you have a process, tools, formats, and roles that are defined that help you bring value to a very specific strategic and tactical approach? So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. And once we have our next speaker finished, then we'll both be answering questions. So Sardi, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. I think Diane, you were the person who told me to make the CFO your best friend. I think it was from something that you shared with us at some point. I think that was a really great advice, and I've actually put it in my book CX3 now. So thank you for that. That was great
Sure,
advice.
My pleasure.
So thank you, Diane. We'll get back to you soon.